We've been around the blog a few times and learned a thing or two. So we came up with an 8-step system that always gets the job done right. It's a set of steps that makes your visuals pop, grab your viewer's attention, and turns software into an artistic tool. These steps are going to be the secret sauce that will help you understand why some images look great while others flop. We'll start with the first step, which is all about nailing the composition. Get ready to rock and roll. Composition is the foundation of every great image. If your composition is off, no matter how great effort you put into your image, it won't look good. For this reason, it is really important to pay attention to the first step. The good news is that if you have some knowledge and learn to plan ahead, you can use the tools to make your composition work. Let's start by explaining what composition really is. Looking at the definition, the composition is simply an arrangement of all the individual elements within our frame to form the final image. We can create the composition in multiple ways, by moving the elements in the scene, changing the camera's position, or adjusting the camera's lens. But also, we can influence the composition by, for example, setting up the lighting, so creating areas of light and shadows, using large surfaces in the shot that has reflective materials or have lots of details. Thinking about the composition, we have to think about the scene visible in the camera as a whole. Every element has an impact on how we perceive the final image. So consider composition as a way of guiding your viewer's eyes towards the most important elements in the image. Now, typically a well-composed image should consist of 3 different layers: foreground, middle ground, and background. This is what makes a visual feel complex and, as a result, interesting. It creates depth and dimension in the image. Of course, we don't have to have all of these 3 elements in each image. Sometimes we can have only the middle ground and background, for example. The foreground is the area in the image that is the closest in the frame. The background, on the other hand, is the area that consists of the elements that are away in the image. And middle ground is everything in between these 2 areas. Other aspect that we should consider when working on the composition are shapes and lines. We can unfold each image, even the most complex one, into simple shapes and lines. Even if we cannot change the shape of the object in the images, we can change their role. Our role is to decide if we want them to be noticeable or rather subtle. We need to ask ourselves the question of which of these elements we want to highlight, expose, and which one we are willing to tone down. We can do it by adjusting the camera angle, setting up the lighting, adding texture, and so on. As you can see, even though we have some limits in the image, we still have tons of control in terms of the composition and the perception we will create within the frame. When discussing shapes in the context of images, it is important to consider the concept of negative space. Negative space refers to the area in the image that is not taken up by the object, but rather the empty space surrounding and between the subject of the image. But it is still a part of the image, and it influences the composition. It may add a breath to the image, but it also may make it too empty. A great example of this concept is the sky. And finally, there are also some tricky shapes in the image that look flat in the viewport of the 3D software, but in reality, they are not. This applies to large surfaces that have reflective materials applied to them, for example, water. Another example can be large surfaces with detailed materials on them like grass or sand. Now, knowing all of this, I have some good news for you. There are some helpers we can use to make the process of composing easier, and these are the composition rules. They are guidelines that tell us what to use in the picture and how to present it. They help us to create visually appealing and effective works. But here, you need to take into consideration all the things I explained before. So sometimes the composition looks good in the viewport, but when we apply materials and add light and sky, we need to adjust our composition along the way. It's an ongoing process. We need to check if the composition still works after making changes. However, composition rules are definitely a good starting point. Anyway, now I will explain to you the most common composition rules. The first one is the rule of thirds. It is the most famous composition rule of all, and at the same time, the easiest to apply. Now imagine breaking the image down into 9 equal pieces, 3 horizontally and 3 vertically. The idea is to put the points of interest in the intersections or along the lines. Golden spire, also called the golden ratio, is based on the Fibonacci sequence in which each number is the sum of the 2 preceding ones. Based on these numbers, we have the squares with the dimensions of the following numbers. Then we draw a spline through the points of these squares. The fascinating thing about this is that we can find many examples of the Fibonacci sequence in real life. For example, plants, shells, or even parts of the human body. Symmetry is a perfect example of balance and harmony. In this case, we create an image where one part of the visual is identical or nearly identical to another. A quick note here. You need to understand that both sides of the image don't have to be precisely the same, but they should have the same visual width and balance on both sides. But more on this in the next lesson. This composition makes architecture look powerful, which is why it is often used in churches or governmental buildings photographs. The golden triangle involves splitting the photo into 4 triangles that contain the same angles. We can create this by drawing a diagonal line from the top right corner to the bottom left corner, then drawing extra lines from the other 2 corners, each meeting the diagonal line at 90-degree angles. We place essential elements in the frame along the diagonal lines and the lines' intersections in the golden triangle. This rule gives the image a more dynamic feel. It is particularly useful if you have any diagonal lines in the picture. You can position elements so they run along these lines. The secret is similar to the rule of thirds, just the rectangle's proportions are different. This one is based on a combination of smaller rectangles in a grid over an image, where 4 of them are based on the golden ratio. There are 3 different types of lines in art: horizontal, vertical, and diagonal. The diagonal composition emphasizes perspective, gives the image a sense of depth, and adds dynamism. The arrangement of objects along the lines leads the eye to the center of the picture. Here remember, the composition rules are only guides. They are to help artists to create compelling images. They definitely should not limit your creativity.